everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lucy, and I am really excited to be here today with author Alice Henderson. Alice most recently is the author of A Solitude of Wolverines and then A Blizzard of Polar Bears. And Alice's love of wild places inspired this new thriller series. And in addition to being a writer, Alice is a wildlife sanctuary monitor, geographic information systems specialist, and a bioacoustician. She surveyed for the presence of grizzlies, wolves, wolverines, jaguars, endangered bats, and more. And the reason I wanted to include that in the introductions is I feel like all of that can come up in a conversation about these books, which there's so much to talk about, this like combination of science and thriller. And so I think we should just jump right in. And maybe you could just start by telling us a little bit about this series that starts with The Solitude of Wolverines.
Wonderful. And thank you for having me, Lucy. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, thank you for being here.
My absolute pleasure. I was saying earlier to Lucy, I am so passionate about libraries, and I'm just honored to be able to have this talk today with you. So my series is about a wildlife biologist named Alex Carter, and each book is about a different imperiled species. So she travels to different, very remote areas to study these endangered species. And the first book, A Solitude of Wolverines, is about wolverines, which a lot of people aren't that familiar with. There are only about 300 left in the lower US, and they're one of the largest members of the weasel family, and they're really fascinating, but they're very much in decline. So I wanted to address them with my first book. So in that book, she goes to a very remote wildlife sanctuary in Montana, and she's tasked with finding if wolverines are still in the area. It's the site of an old ski resort where there used to be wolverines there when the ski resort first started, but now they haven't been seen in many decades. So Alex sets out her remote cameras and to see if she can see any wolverines on them, but instead she gets an image of a severely injured man wandering on the preserve, and too late she realizes she's stumbled into an operation that people would kill to keep secret. So that's the first book. And the second book finds Alex in the Canadian Arctic and Hudson Bay, where she's studying the Western Hudson Bay population of polar bears. And at first her study's going well. She tracks the bears by helicopter and tags them to study them and see their health. And it's going pretty well, but then things start to go awry. Her helicopter pilot quits. Equipment goes missing. Someone breaks into her lab and steals the samples she's collected. She starts to realize that someone does not want this study to move forward. And as things get more dangerous, she realizes they're willing to go to great lengths to stop her study.
Well, Alex herself, I think, is such a great character. She's so strong and resourceful, and I'd love if you could just tell us a little bit more about like how you came up with her, because I think she's just unique to a thriller series for a female protagonist.
Thank you for saying that. And I noticed that when I'm reading thrillers, which are my favorite thing to read, especially thrillers with science or history, that the female characters are oftentimes there to have relationships with the male leads instead of more standing on their own. And I really wanted to create a strong female protagonist who was very resourceful, who was able to fight and fix things, tinker with machines, for example, and could really think on her feet and fight her way out of situations. And she has a mother who was a combat pilot with the Air Force. So her mother really wanted to be sure that Alex could take care of herself. And so Alex knows how to handle all kinds of guns, and she knows the martial art Jeet Kune Do. And I just really loved writing about her and really getting into this character that I could really get behind. And also, she has a lot of heart. She's very passionate about helping wildlife. So I think readers hopefully can identify with her on an emotional level as well as, seeing that she's very resourceful and can take care of herself.
Yeah, I would say definitely. I think that was one of the things that struck me right away. That was just like, here's this woman who can do so much cool stuff and is like, has this desire to just stick with it. And one of the things where I think she's so resourceful is the way she uses like the topography and the settings around her. And I love that part of these books where like the environment and the background is not passive. It's really definitely a character in your books. So I was wondering, like, how familiar are you with? We had the Rockies in Montana, and then the Canadian Arctic. So are those environments that you're familiar with? Because I really felt like you kind of pulled me right into them. So
thank you. That's a huge compliment.
yeah.
Yes, absolutely. As you mentioned earlier, in addition to being a writer, I do wildlife research myself. So for Montana, I was actually on a wildlife sanctuary myself in Montana, putting out remote cameras and bioacoustic equipment in the hopes of getting wolves and wolverines when I got the idea for this series. So it was a very remote part of Montana, very isolated, and I thought this would be a great setting for a thriller, because you really are out there on your own and you have to really be resourceful. And as you say, I really thought about how can Alex use this topography to her advantage, or what tools does she have at hand? If she's caught out there without any means of communication, cut off from the police, for example, what can she use to get out of this and survive and help the animals too? So I love Montana. I spent a lot of time there. I also set another novel, Voracious, there in the Glacier National Park. And then with the Canadian Rockies in 2009, I'm sorry, in the Canadian Arctic in 2019, just before the lockdown, I was up there for months, but I was actually in the Northwest Territories side of things, like Yukon, Northwest Territories, where the Beaufort Sea polar bear population lives. And I had plans to go to Hudson Bay in October of 2020, but as you can imagine, that did not happen. But I spent months in the other side of the Canadian Arctic, and I just fell in love with it. I was up there long enough to, when I first came up there, it was summer, so the tundra was very green, and the ocean was, the belugas were there, and then as it wore on, the tundra turned these beautiful fall colors of golds and reds. And then as I drove out, it was absolutely blizzarding, whiteout conditions. It's freezing. I remember the Arctic Ocean was just this choppy gray. It was so cold up there. You're out in the open, your eyes are tearing, and but I just loved it. I saw so much wildlife, and I feel very passionately about polar bears, which are not doing well. The latest studies estimate all 19 subpopulations may be gone by 2080. So it's pretty bad for them. So I really wanted to set the next book there. And Western Hudson Bay is one of the populations that's in decline.
Well, speaking of that science part too, like I loved, there's a thriller part, but then I loved learning about polar bears and wolverines, and not just about the animals themselves, which were fascinating. There was so much I didn't know, and I'm sort of just enamored of both species now, but also like how they're tracked in the wild or how they're studied. And you said you've had some experience being in those places, like, and especially with the wolverines, but I'm wondering what combination of research and experience you put into these. Like, how much research did it require? Because the science just seems so authentic and accurate. So
thank you so much. So with wolverines, I've done similar to what Alex is doing in this, where you're setting out non-invasive, sort of passive ways to capture data for wolverines. For example, you might have remote cameras out there, or as Alex does, and wolverine researchers do this, they not only set up a camera trap, but the camera trap, they say trap, but it's just to trap it on film. And they set up these little hair snares. So when the wolverine passes through the hair snare, these little alligator clips clip off their fur. And then they can run DNA on the fur. They can also, the way that these camera traps are set up is it's usually with a bait station. So you've got meat up above, and as the wolverines reach up for the meat, it takes a photograph of their bellies, and every wolverine has a unique belly fur pattern, so they can also tell what individual it is just from that picture. And then when they run the DNA on the fur, they can see if there's a paternal or maternal relationship. They can also see if a mother has recently had kits. So that's a really neat non-invasive way, because you're not actually capturing the wolverine and sedating it and implanting a tracker, because wolverines are just, they're so wonderfully resourceful. They just get the collars right off. So they don't fit them with collars. They actually surgically implant a tracker. And then with the polar bears, I talked to two polar bear researchers with Polar Bears International, who do that exact kind of research where they're flying on helicopters. They tranquilize the polar bears from the helicopter, and then they land once the bear is out and take samples of its fur and fat. They put a little, sometimes it's an ear disc for the males that, you know, they put the ear discs on both, but the male's head is so narrow that if they were to, or actually a better way to put it was their necks are so thick that if they put the collar on, it just slips right off. So they tend to just collar the females. And in my book, Alex is using a burr on fur, which is something that actually 3M is working on right now. And it's instead something that, instead of a bulky collar, it just is something that attaches through Velcro or little other attachments to embed in their fur, which is just a smaller way to track them and less invasive than this massive collar. And I really wanted to get the science right. That's really important to me, that it be accurate. So I asked these people just down to the nitty gritty, you know, what exactly are they doing to measure the bear, weigh the bear, what tools do they use to take hair samples and claw samples and things like that.
Well, I think that like all those details really come through, and they just create like such an immersive experience as far as the science. But then the other immersive part I thought of these books was like the action sequences. I was so impressed with how well you did those and just how thrilling they were. And you kind of like pulled right in, but they're also really detailed. And again, you know, Alex is using what's around her. Is it hard for you to write those, or how do you put yourself in the headspace to kind of get, you know, in that place?
That's actually my favorite thing to write, is action
Really?
scenes and fight scenes. I love them so much that when I know one's coming up and I start writing the scene, it'll be hours later and it's just flown by. I absolutely love writing them. And for the fight scene specifically, I studied the same martial art that Alex does. Again, I wanted it to be accurate. So when I'm about to write a fight scene, I don't tend to plot them out blow by blow ahead of time. I know how injured can Alex get at this point? How injured can her opponent be? What kind of first aid does she have on hand? And then I just let the fight happen in my mind. And so I'm just kind of watching her fight in a way like more like I'm a chronicler of her fighting than I am actually the person behind it writing it. And then with action, I'm always thinking I remember reading, I think it was Dinar Kuntz, a quote, and he said something like, "Never be easy on your characters." And I read that as a teen when I was first, starting to write novels. And I thought, okay, so with the action scenes, I think, okay, what can go wrong here? What all can she lose that, she loses, say, her means of communication, she loses her mode of transportation, she's trapped. And then I just go from there, like, how can she get out of this? And I want the scenes to be very cathartic. So usually her solutions are kind of high adrenaline solutions.
Yeah, I mean I guess like hearing that you love writing them, I can see that coming through in them, because I feel like in the same way that you're saying you get pulled in and you're chronicling it, it's like I put my head down in those pages and then I'm just in there, and I looked up and I was like, woo. But it just keeps coming for her, and she just keeps getting out of it. So it was so thrilling to read that. And I'm wondering how you came up with like deciding to combine this detailed, fascinating science with this like gripping thriller. What was the idea behind putting these two together?
Well, as I said before, I'm so passionate about wildlife, and the work that I do can be very depressing. Studying these species who are just in decline and they have no federal protections. For example, the wolverine has no federal protections at all. So it's discouraging, and I wanted to engage with people and talk to people about it and get them involved and, encourage them to write their representatives I mean, the example of, both the wolverine and the polar bear are in decline because of climate change. So, I wanted people to take action and be inspired. I thought if I wrote a nonfiction book about wolverines, probably the only people that would pick it up would be people who already knew about wolverines and knew about their precarious situation. And I wanted to reach a wider audience. And I love thrillers. As I said, that's my favorite thing to read. So I thought, well, why don't I take this information about these imperiled species, but write a gripping, suspenseful series of novels about them so that, hopefully people will pick them up for the story and the excitement and the characters. And then on the side, they're learning about these neat species and what can be done to help them and what has caused their decline, and hopefully, inspire, encourage them to take action.
Yeah, well, I think I could see that, I gave your first book to my father because he loves thrillers, but I also know that he's like a fact friend. So he's going to, just instantly be pulled into all the really cool things that you learn about wolverines in there, like how they're just so amazing how they eat everything and they can climb up basically vertical planes. And so I think the combination of the two of them was just a really fun thing to read, but also just so informative as well. How long have you been writing? Has it been something that you've been doing your whole life, or?
It is. So I started writing when I was 6. My father, who's also a writer, gave me his old Underwood manual typewriter because he upgraded to an electric one. And I don't know why, but my 6-year-old self thought, this is the kind of typewriter that bad detective fiction should be written on. And I had listened to a lot of old time radio detectives with my parents. And so I decided I would create this character who, instead of having a smooth, cool name like Sam Spade, Richard Diamond, he would have a super awkward name and be like a terrible detective who couldn't get any of the clues right and was always, going after the wrong person. And so I created this private investigator named Maynard A. Flitchenheimer III, PI. And I started writing stories in his case book. And of course, he, just awful. He never caught the right person. He never solved the crimes. He was just clueless to all these, clues staring him right in the face. And then I started writing science fiction and some horror and ghost stories. And I wrote my first novel in 7th grade. It's a science fiction novel that is so unintentionally bad. It's pretty much a comedy. And then I wrote my second novel in high school. And then I started submitting when I was an undergrad, started submitting novels. I didn't submit those early ones, though. I think I wrote 4 novels before my first one was published. So,
wow, that's impressive that you started so young. And can you tell us a little bit about what, in addition to being a writer, some of the wildlife research and work that you do?
Absolutely. So both my undergrad and grad are sort of a mix of the arts and the sciences. So my undergrad is a mix of writing and then field zoology and biogeography and things like that. And I really fell in love with geographic information systems in graduate school, where I studied climatology and other sciences in addition to the arts. And GIS is so neat, geographic information systems, because it allows me to I can map or preserve, for example, and see if I can combine all of these layers to see, does this area of the watershed need restoration? Or I can also map out possible wildlife corridors, and I can see, okay, if we preserve this swath of land, are there blocks to the animal movement? Is there a dam here? Is there a pinch point, say, where development is encroaching and wildlife will soon not be able to get through that area? And I do a lot of pro bono work for different nonprofits. I'm a partner of Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, which is an amazing organization that is protecting land from Yellowstone all the way up to the Yukon. And they've done an amazing job preserving land and talking to private landowners about putting conservation easements on their land so wildlife can move through it. And then for other land trusts like the Wildlife Land Trust, which is an arm of the Humane Society, actually, they have preserves all over the US and where wildlife is protected. And with them, I go to these preserves and I set out my bioacoustic equipment. And that way I can see in a very non-invasive way what species are using that land. So for example, I'll go out to a preserve and I'll set out a recorder that has a ultrasonic microphone and a regular audible microphone. And then I can withdraw from the area, which is great because then wildlife can resume its normal duties with their normal activities with no humans around. And then I come back and I retrieve the equipment and I can look at that information, and the ultrasonic channel will record bats. So I'm able to, obviously we can't hear bats because they're in the ultrasonic, but I can visually examine these recordings and I can tell not only what species of bat is there, but even what the bats are doing. It's really fascinating. Like every species of bat has its own unique echolocation call. It has a different shape, a different frequency, a different time between calls. Bats, for example, pulse on the downsweep of their wings. So if it's a really big bat, the time between these pulses will be slower. And if it's a little bat, it'll be much faster. You can even see when they narrow down to water, and you can see the little buzz as their pulses reflect off the water and they drink. So that's really neat. And then on the audible channel, I can identify bird species, amphibians, things like wolves. And so it's just a neat way without, being invasive to discover what species are using it. And I also walk transects, look for prints, look for poop, other glamorous aspects of the wildlife researcher's life.
So you're spending all this time outside with wildlife, and I'm just wondering if there's you have one amazing, you probably have more than one amazing, but just one that stands out wildlife encounter.
The one that stands out to me the most, I was in Montana and I was hiking along a lake shore, and it was this really rocky, and it was a trail that had been used so much that unfortunately the roots were exposed on the trail bed. So I had my head down and I was stepping over these roots and rocks. And all of a sudden I smelled this smell of rotten meat. And I looked up, and just a few feet away from me was a grizzly bear stripping berries off these bushes. And I stopped and he stopped, and he took 2 steps onto the trail, still standing up, right in front of me. And I looked down. I didn't make eye contact because I didn't, want him to think I was challenging him. So I kind of turned to the side to look smaller, and I looked down, and he sniffed me from head to stomach. And I remember my eyes were right at the level of these massive claws, hanging down. And I saw that I guess he'd been eating a carcass because the rotten meat smell was coming from meat stuck in his fur. And then he just went down on all fours and left. And I wasn't scared at all through this whole thing. I was exhilarated. This is the coolest thing that's ever happened. I didn't feel threatened at all. I just felt like he was curious. And it was just a really neat experience. I was out there in the woods. He was out there in the woods. We're just 2 animals and that happened upon each other. And it was just so wonderful. And I turned around and went back because I thought I probably want to go back and finish eating those berries. I didn't want to get in his way and bug him. And I passed this couple coming that way, and I said, "There's a grizzly bear." They just turned around and booked out of there. But
yeah, that would be me. I mean, that's amazing what you just described, but it also sounds terrifying to me. That is just really close. But that's just amazing. And it makes me think about some ways that you connect your reader also with wildlife, or I love the fact that you include all these great resources at the end of both of these books. It's a good way to, continue your learning, but also I found myself going down some rabbit holes and finding out where I can watch a documentary on wolverines and these polar bear cams. And so I love that all of that information is included. But do you have recommendations like beyond that of books or books that you think are great for learning about like the environment or the climate or animals?
Absolutely. There are, especially with climate, I think that a lot of the conversation going on now is very depressing and discouraging and doom and gloom. And I think a lot of people are struggling with hope and feeling like, even if they care and they want to take action, there's not sure what kind of action to take. So I've been reading lately a lot of books about exactly that. How do we maintain our hope? How do we reach people? How do we reach politicians and talk to them? So if you want to read some books that can give you hope and give you ideas of ways to take action, a great one is What We Think About When We Try Not to Think About Global Warming, which talks about shifting the thought of this doom and gloom. Oh, we have to sacrifice things if we're going to get better. Instead, it reframes it like, think of the exciting future we're going to have: cleaner water, cleaner air, healthier bodies. And it's really an opportunity to envision this much more hopeful future and a great future. And we can all work together as communities and, at your workplace. And it talks about maybe, operating on a smaller level where you can really have an impact among your neighbors, among your community. And then there's two great books by Paul Hawken. The first one is called Drawdown, and it's the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. And in it, he has a number of ways to draw carbon down from the atmosphere. And he just last fall published a second one, which talks about ending the climate crisis in one generation. And that book is called Regeneration. And there's a great website. If you go to regeneration.org, you can see all of these ways that we can work together on a number of different levels, locally and with our communities, so that we're not endlessly waiting for government, say, to pass climate change legislation, which is really getting bogged down. So it's just a fantastic way. And I've also been reading by Catherine Hayhoe a book called Saving Us. And that's very much about hope and how to even talk to people without even bringing up climate change. Like, for example, here in the mountains, our ski season is getting shorter and shorter and shorter because of climate change. But you can engage people just about skiing, like, hey, do you miss those longer ski seasons? And do you miss that quality of snow? Well, let's work together and bring that back and help bring that back. So those are three really good ones that I enjoy.
Well, thank you. Those are all really great recommendations. What are there genres that you like to read, like outside of these nonfiction books that you told us about? Like, what's your favorite genre?
I love thrillers that have science and history. Mm-hmm. So James Rollins, I like his thrillers. Douglas Preston, Lincoln Child, and I love historical mysteries. So I just started this series by Irina Shapiro, which is about a detective in 1860s England. And P.B. Ryan, she wrote a great series about a detective in 1860s Boston. And so I love historical mysteries too. And my favorite writer is Robert McCammon. And he writes, he used to write horror. Now he's mainly writing these mysteries set in colonial America about a detective. And they're just talk about being steeped in an atmosphere and feeling like you're really there. I mean, he's just so gifted.
Wow, I'm going to have to, I just wrote down like everything that you said. So now I have a new reading list. So where are we going to see Alex Carter next?
I just finished book 3 and my editor has it, and it's called A Ghost of Caribou. And it's about mountain caribou in Washington State. So we used to have mountain caribou in the lower 48. And unfortunately, they were all extirpated in 2019. And so there's just a few of southern mountain caribou living in British Columbia. And we had 2 left, and British Columbia actually took them because they weren't going to make it here. And so in the book, there's a Trust Sanctuary up in Washington State, and they think they might have gotten a mountain caribou on one of the remote cameras, like it's wandered down from Canada. So Alex is tasked with confirming that. But there's a lot of strife going on in the area. There's a stalled out clear cutting project, and activists are there. And then the body of a Forest Service ranger is found strung up in the town park. So
I cannot wait for that. That sounds as exciting as these other two. So I think I feel like we've just really only scratched the surface with what I could ask you here, but I could probably go on for hours. So I think that is probably all the questions I have, unless there's something that you desperately want to add or if I didn't include.
No, this was absolutely wonderful. I guess I would just add that this is a really important time, and I hope that people will take action and do things, even small things like, write your representative. Or a really fun thing is engage in citizen science. A lot of researchers are looking for just regular, or actually citizen science is now referred to as community science. They're looking just for members of the community to go through their data with them because they have so many. For example, two super cool projects you could help with. One is just looking at these pictures of penguins in Antarctica, and you're just sort of counting them and counting eggs and counting chicks, and you can do it from your computer. And then another one is you can categorize manatee calls and help scientists go through all of these recordings they have of manatee calls. So if you go to scistarter.org or zooniverse.org, you can look at all of these neat projects you can help with, and then also just getting out and into the field. And there's a lot of volunteer projects. You can actually track wolverines with Conservation Northwest in the winter, and then really, get your hands dirty and get out in the field and help. And so I hope people will be inspired to help wildlife.
Well, yeah, I think that they will. I think these books are very inspiring, and this conversation has been very inspiring. So I'm really, really glad that you joined us and we got to talk about these books. And I am looking forward to the next Alex Carter book and then hopefully more after that. So thank you again, Alice, for talking with us today.
Thank you so much, Lucy. This has been a real pleasure.